Lift your toes off the ground, seated or standing, wherever you are. Point them toward the ceiling as hard as you can. Hold for 10 seconds. Burn in the front of your shin arrived faster than you expected. Sharp, specific, unfamiliar. A muscle you have almost certainly never trained, never thought about, and never been asked about by any physician who has examined you. That burn is mapping something you cannot see, the margin between your foot and the floor during every step you take. That margin is 2 centimeters. You have felt it close. You caught your toe on something that was not there. A flat pavement, a rug edge so thin it should not register. The lip where one floor surface meets another. A transition you have crossed 1,000 times without incident. Today your foot caught. The stumble was minor, a brief lurch forward, a recovery step, a moment of surprise that passed before anyone noticed. You noticed. You looked back at what tripped you. There was nothing, Matt. The surface was flat. The obstacle did not change. Something in your body changed. The margin between the bottom of your foot and the surface you are walking across has been narrowing, so gradually that you never felt it shrink, so silently that you never knew the margin existed until the day it ran out and your toe caught on a surface it used to clear without thought. Most people dismiss it as a clumsy moment. A clumsy moment. A lapse in attention. An aging body doing what aging bodies do. But the physics says otherwise. The trip was not a lapse. It was a measurement, a moment where the declining clearance margin between your foot and the ground crossed below the height of an obstacle that has been an identical height for years. The rug edge did not grow. The pavement crack did not rise. The threshold between the kitchen tile and the hallway carpet did not change by a single millimeter since the day it was installed. Your foot dropped, invisible for a specific reason. The margin starts large enough that early losses do not produce symptoms. A person at 40 might clear the ground by 3 centimeters during swing phase, a comfortable buffer that absorbs a 1 centimeter obstacle without the person ever knowing the obstacle was there. At 50, the clearance has narrowed to 2.5 centimeters. Still comfortable, still no symptoms. At 60, 2 centimeters functional, but the buffer has halved. At 65, 1.5 centimeters. The rug edge that was invisible at 40 now catches the toe once every few months. At 70, 1 centimeter. The trips become frequent enough to notice a pattern, but by the time the pattern is visible, the margin has been narrowing for 20 years. 2 centimeters. During the swing phase of walking, the moment when your foot leaves the ground and travels forward through the air before the next heel strike, the lowest point of the foot passes approximately 2 centimeters above the ground surface. Winter and colleagues established this measurement through motion capture analysis at the University of Waterloo, tracking minimum toe clearance across hundreds of gait cycles in subjects of all ages. 2 centimeters average clearance, 0.5 centimeter a standard deviation. The foot passes within a narrow, consistent band above the surface, a band maintained entirely by the muscle that just burned in the front of your shin. That muscle is the tibialis anterior. It runs down the front of the shin from the lateral condyle of the tibia to the medial cuneiform and first metatarsal of the foot. Its primary action is dorsiflexion, lifting the foot upward at the ankle, bringing the toes toward the shin. Every step you take requires the tibialis anterior to fire twice, once during the swing phase to lift the foot and clear the ground, and once at heel strike to control the foot's descent from heel contact to flat foot position. Without the heel strike contraction, the foot would slap the ground with each step, the audible foot slap that characterizes early tibialis anterior weakness, before the clearance margin has narrowed enough to produce tripping. During the swing phase, approximately 400 milliseconds of each gait cycle, the tibialis anterior contracts to dorsiflex the foot through 15 to 20 degrees above neutral. This range creates a toe clearance of 2 to 3 centimeters at normal walking speed. Reduced dorsiflexion strength produces less angular lift. Less angular lift produces lower toe height. Lower toe height produces a foot that passes closer to the ground with every step. The relationship is linear until the clearance reaches 0, and then it is a trip. Clearance margin operates with a safety buffer measured in millimeters, and understanding how small the buffer is requires understanding what the foot does during each step. The gait cycle divides into 2 phases: stance phase, when the foot is on the ground bearing weight, and swing phase, when the foot is in the air traveling forward to the next step. Stance occupies approximately 60% of the cycle. Swing occupies approximately 40%, roughly 400 milliseconds at normal walking speed. During swing phase, the foot must travel forward and clear the ground simultaneously. The hip flexors swing the leg forward. The knee flexes to shorten the leg and lift the foot away from the ground, and the tibialis anterior dorsiflexes the ankle to point the toes upward, preventing them from dragging along the surface as the leg swings through. All three actions must coordinate precisely within the 400 millisecond window. If the hip flexion is adequate but the dorsiflexion is insufficient, the toes drop toward the ground during mid-swing, the point where the foot is directly beneath the body and the clearance is at its minimum. Minimum clearance occurs at approximately 50% of the swing phase, the moment when the swinging foot passes directly under the body's center of mass. At this instant, the foot is at its lowest point in the swing arc. Before and after this point, the foot is higher, rising from toe-off at the beginning and descending to heel strike at the end. The minimum clearance is the critical measurement because it determines whether the foot clears or catches. A foot clearing the ground by 2 centimeters at the minimum point will clear a 1 centimeter obstacle, a rug edge, a threshold, a cracked pavement lip. A foot clearing by 1 centimeter will trip on that obstacle. The difference between clearing and tripping is a reduction of 1 centimeter, a change invisible to the walker, invisible to an observer, detectable only by motion capture analysis. You cannot feel the margin narrowing. You can only feel the moment it runs out. And then, Begg and colleagues demonstrated the age dimension in gait and posture. Older adults show not only lower mean clearance, but higher stride-to-stride variability. The foot passes closer to the ground on average and varies more in how close it passes from one step to the next. Lower mean plus higher variance means the probability of the foot contacting the ground during any given swing phase increases non-linearly with age. The trip is not random. It is the statistical inevitability of a narrowing margin with increasing noise. Now, the paradox that makes the tibialis anterior different from every other muscle affected by sarcopenia. Walking loads the tibialis anterior at its lowest possible intensity. The muscle lifts a 1 kilogram foot through 10 to 15 degrees of dorsiflexion against gravity, and nothing more, no additional resistance, no load beyond the foot's own weight. Murley and colleagues published the electromyographic data in the Journal of Foot and Ankle Research. Tibialis anterior activation during normal walking is approximately 10 to 15% of maximum voluntary contraction. Consider what that means in training terms. Every other major muscle group receives loading during daily activity that approaches or exceeds the maintenance threshold. The quadriceps bear body weight with every step, loading at 30 to 50% of maximum during level walking, higher on stairs. The calves push off against body weight at every toe off, body weight loading the posterior compartment with every stride. The spinal extensors support the torso against gravity throughout the day. Even the forearm flexors receive meaningful loading when gripping door handles, bags, and jars. 1 kilogram, the tibialis anterior receives 1 kilogram, the weight of the foot and nothing else. It fires 20,000 times per day during walking, twice per step, 10,000 steps, but never once at an intensity that approaches the mechanotransduction threshold for maintenance. The muscle receives an activation signal with every step. It does not receive a loading signal with any step. Activation without loading maintains neural recruitment patterns. The motor cortex continues to know how to fire the tibialis anterior in the correct sequence during the gait cycle. But activation without loading does not maintain muscle cross-sectional area. The tibialis anterior can fire correctly with every step while simultaneously atrophying from insufficient mechanical stimulus. Usage is not loading, activity is not training, and the muscle weakens while working. The person who walks 10,000 steps per day activates their tibialis anterior 20,000 times and never once loads it at an intensity that stimulates even maintenance, let alone hypertrophy. The sarcopenic rate, 1 to 2% of force-generating capacity lost per year after 50, operates unimpeded because walking provides zero counter-stimulus. The heel drop script described the calf muscles of the posterior compartment, the gastrocnemius and soleus that push the foot downward. The tibialis anterior sits in the anterior compartment and performs the opposite action, pulling the foot upward. The calf receives loading from body weight with every step. The tibialis anterior receives only the weight of the foot. 1 kilogram versus 70, The ratio is 1 to 70, and the mechanotransduction threshold does not scale with muscle size. The tibialis anterior requires the same proportional loading intensity as the quadriceps or the calf to maintain its cross-sectional area. It receives 1/70th of the proportional stimulus. The asymmetry in loading stimulus is the asymmetry in preservation. The calf maintains its mass through walking, while the tibialis anterior loses its mass despite walking. The morning I lifted my toes off the kitchen floor and tried to walk forward on my heels, 4 foot completely off the ground, weight entirely on the heel and posterior sole. The tibialis anterior fatigue arrived within 8 seconds. 8 seconds of near maximum contraction from a muscle that had been firing 20,000 times per day for decades at 10% intensity. The gap between activation and loading was 8 seconds wide. The muscle that had been working all day, every day for years, could not sustain a genuine workload for 10 seconds. The shin burned with a metabolic demand it had not experienced since the last time anyone asked this muscle to actually work, which was never, because no common daily activity requires sustained maximum dorsiflexion. You know the margin, the muscle, and the paradox. A muscle that works 20,000 times daily while receiving zero training stimulus, atrophying at the sarcopenic rate despite constant activation, losing the force-generating capacity that maintains the 2 centimeters separating every step from a trip. The question changes from why the margin narrows to how many factors are narrowing it simultaneously, because the tibialis anterior is not the only variable attacking the 2 centimeters. 5 independent factors converge on the clearance margin after 60, each one narrowing it from a different direction, all accelerating together. Tibialis anterior force output declines at the sarcopenic rate, 1 to 2% per year, compounded by the zero training paradox. The muscle that lifts the foot produces less lift with each passing year. At 60, a person may have lost 20 to 30% of the dorsiflexion force they had at 40. The angular lift that produced 3 centimeters of clearance now produces 2. The margin that was comfortable is now minimal, clinically invisible until it produces symptoms. No physician measures tibialis anterior strength during a routine examination. No standard screening includes dorsiflexion force testing. The first clinical sign is often the trip itself, or the audible foot slap that precedes it by months. Foot slap occurs when the tibialis anterior can no longer control the foot's descent from heel strike to flat foot contact at normal walking speed. The foot drops to the ground in an uncontrolled plantar flexion, producing a slapping sound with each step that the person may not notice but their walking companion hears. The foot slap is the acoustic warning that the clearance margin is narrowing. The eccentric control of heel strike has failed before the concentric lift of swing phase fails. The slap comes first, the trip comes later. Ankle dorsiflexion range decreases independently of muscle strength, a distinction that matters because many people assume stretching alone will prevent tripping. Stretching addresses range. It does not address the tibialis anterior force that uses the range to lift the foot. Both must be adequate for clearance to hold. The Achilles tendon and gastrocnemius soleus complex stiffen through collagen cross-linking, the same progressive loss of tissue compliance that affects every tendon and ligament with age. Even if the tibialis anterior maintained full strength, the stiffened antagonist restricts how far the foot can rise. The ceiling lowers while the muscle weakens. Strength and range are independent variables that both must be adequate for the margin to hold. Proprioceptive acuity in the ankle declines. The mechanoreceptors in the ankle joint capsule that report foot position to the cerebellum lose density and response speed with age. The barefoot and balance work the channel has described addresses this dimension specifically. The Ruffini endings that detect joint angle, the Pacinian corpuscles that detect rapid positional changes, the Golgi-type endings that detect endpoint positions, all decrease in receptor density and signal fidelity after 50. Cerebellar computation that calibrates toe clearance operates on proprioceptive data from every stride. The cerebellum receives ankle position data from the joint receptors, muscle length data from the muscle spindles, and ground contact data from the plantar mechanoreceptors. It uses this data to calculate the dorsiflexion angle required to clear the expected ground surface on the next stride. When the proprioceptive input degrades, when the receptors report ankle position with less precision, the cerebellar computation becomes less accurate. The clearance the cerebellum calculates may be 2 centimeters on average, but with a wider error band. Some strides clear by 3 centimeters, some clear by 1. The mean may be adequate while individual strides dip below the threshold. And it is individual strides, not averages, that produce trips. Visual processing speed decreases. The obstacle detection system that adjusts stride parameters when an obstacle appears in the walking path operates more slowly with age. The system works in 3 stages. Detection, the visual cortex identifies the obstacle. Planning, the motor cortex calculates the stride adjustment required to clear it. And execution, the adjusted motor command reaches the leg muscles in time to modify the swing phase. Each stage takes time. The total processing time from retinal detection to muscular adjustment is approximately 200 to 300 milliseconds in a young adult. In an adult over 70, the total processing time extends to 350 to 450 milliseconds as visual processing speed, motor planning speed, and neural conduction velocity all slow independently. At normal walking speed, approximately 1.2 meters per second, an obstacle detected 2 steps ahead provides approximately 1 second of processing time. Adequate for both young and old. An obstacle detected 1 step ahead provides approximately 500 milliseconds, adequate for the young adult at 250 milliseconds total processing time. Marginal for the older adult at 400 milliseconds, leaving only 100 milliseconds for the adjusted motor command to propagate from cortex to tibialis anterior. Inadequate if the obstacle appears at mid-stride because the swing phase is already committed and the dorsiflexion angle has already been set by the cerebellar computation. The foot passes at the clearance the cerebellum calculated before the obstacle was detected. If that clearance is insufficient, if the 1.5 centimeters of habitual clearance is less than the 2 centimeter obstacle height, the toe catches. Well, stride-to-stride variability increases. Begg's data showed that older adults have higher variance in minimum toe clearance from one step to the next. In a system operating with 2 centimeters of mean clearance and half a centimeter of standard deviation, the probability of any single stride dipping below 0 clearance is vanishingly small, fewer than 1 stride in 10,000. The margin is comfortable and the variance is contained. The person trips essentially never, at 1.2 centimeters mean and 0.7 centimeters standard deviation. The values Begg measured in community-dwelling older adults. The probability shifts dramatically. 1 stride in approximately 500 dips below 0 clearance. Over 10,000 steps in a day, that is 20 strides where the foot contacts the ground during swing phase. Not all of these contacts produce a scuff, a drag, a momentary catch that the recovery mechanisms absorb, but each contact is a lottery ticket for the full trip, the full stumble, the full fall. 20 lottery tickets per day, every day, with each year adding more tickets as the mean drops and the variance widens. Tripping is not random. It is the stride where 5 declining variables, tibialis anterior force, dorsiflexion range, proprioceptive accuracy, visual processing speed, and stride-to-stride variance converged on the wrong side of the margin. The convergence was probabilistic. The factors that made it probable were deterministic. Muscle weakness, range restriction, and clearance decline are all measurable. Each one is addressable through specific intervention, and 2 of the 5 are directly addressable with 30 seconds of heel walking performed twice daily on any flat surface. Each factor alone is manageable. Together they produce the nonlinear increase in fall risk reported after 65, a curve that steepens not because one system failed catastrophically, but because 5 systems compounded gradually until the margin disappeared. The consequences of the trip compound separately from the causes. A trip at 40 produces a stumble and a story. A trip at 70 produces a hip fracture, a hospitalization, a loss of mobility confidence, a reduction in walking activity, an acceleration of the sarcopenia that caused the trip, and a steepening of the decline curve that makes the next trip more likely. The first fall is not the endpoint. It is the accelerant, the event that converts gradual decline into rapid decline by removing the walking activity that was providing the minimal tibialis anterior activation the muscle still received. 20% of adults over 65 who sustain a hip fracture from a fall do not survive the following 12 months, and the mortality is not from the fracture itself, but from the immobility, the hospital-acquired infection, the deconditioning, and the loss of physiological reserve that the hospitalization period produces. Among those who survive, 50% do not return to their pre-fall activity level. the margin that prevents the trip, prevents the fracture, that prevents the hospitalization, that prevents the deconditioning spiral. 2 centimeters of toe clearance is not a fitness metric. It is the mechanical buffer between independent living and the cascade that begins with a toe catching on a surface it used to clear. That convergence, muscle weakening, range stiffening, sensory processing degrading, variability widening, all attacking the same 2 centimeters, is why I set the heel walk at the start and end of every day. Not as exercise, as mechanical input to the 2 factors most directly under muscular control and most responsive to loading intervention. Anyone with peripheral neuropathy affecting foot sensation, an active ankle injury, or a balance disorder that increases fall risk should perform heel walking near a wall or countertop they can reach for support. The sustained dorsiflexion challenge combined with the posterior weight shift may exceed balance capacity in the first sessions before the tibialis anterior strength adapts to the demand. Walking on the heels. Forefoot completely off the ground, toes pointing toward the ceiling, body weight entirely on the heel and posterior sole, requires the tibialis anterior to contract at near maximum capacity for every second of the walk. The muscle must hold the foot in full dorsiflexion against the combined resistance of the foot's weight and the passive elastic tension of the Achilles tendon pulling the foot back toward plantar flexion. Normal walking loads the tibialis anterior at 10 to 15% of maximum. Heel walking loads it at an estimated 70 to 80%, an anatomical estimate based on the sustained full-range dorsiflexion against antagonist passive tension, noting that direct EMG measurement during heel walking has not been published in the literature reviewed for this brief. The gap between 10% and 70% is the training threshold gap, the distance between activation and loading that the 20,000 daily steps never cross. And then, the heel walk addresses the second factor simultaneously through reciprocal inhibition. When the tibialis anterior contracts at maximum to hold full dorsiflexion, the opposing gastrocnemius solois complex must relax. This is Sherrington's law of reciprocal innervation, a spinal reflex that inhibits the motor neurons of the antagonist muscle when the agonist contracts. The inhibition is automatic. The reflex fires at the spinal cord level without requiring conscious effort to relax the calf. The tibialis anterior contracts. The inhibitory interneuron fires. The gastrocnemius motor neurons receive an inhibitory signal. The calf relaxes. Antagonist relaxation allows the ankle to move deeper into dorsiflexion than passive stretching alone achieves. During a passive calf stretch, leaning against a wall with the heel on the ground, the gastrocnemius resists the stretch through its own stretch reflex. The muscle spindles detect the lengthening and trigger a reflexive contraction that opposes the stretch. The passive stretch reflects the stretch reflex. During heel walking, the reciprocal inhibition suppresses the stretch reflex. The spinal inhibition from the tibialis anterior contraction overrides the stretch reflex from the gastrocnemius spindles. The calf relaxes more completely. The ankle moves further into dorsiflexion. The Achilles tendon receives a deeper stretch under conditions where the neural resistance has been removed. Heel walking strengthens the tibialis anterior and stretches the gastrocnemius Achilles complex simultaneously, addressing muscle weakness and range restriction in one action. 2 of the 5 convergence factors addressed by 30 seconds of walking on the heels. 30 seconds. Stand on a flat surface near a wall or countertop for initial balance support. Lift the forefoot completely off the ground, toes pointing toward the ceiling. Weight entirely on the heels and posterior sole. Walk forward 10 to 15 steps in this position. The tibialis anterior will fatigue within the first 10 seconds. The shin will burn with a metabolic demand the muscle has not experienced during any recent walking session. The burn is the loading gap made tangible, the distance between the 10% activation of normal walking and the 70+% demand of sustained full dorsiflexion. Walk back to the starting position. Total time, approximately 30 seconds. Total time, approximately. After the 30-second walk, stand normally and feel the reactive hyperemia in the anterior compartment, the warmth along the front of the shin as blood rushes into the capillary beds that were compressed during the sustained contraction. The vasodilatory metabolites that accumulated during the hold, adenosine, hydrogen ions, carbon dioxide, trigger arteriolar dilation that produces blood flow exceeding the pre-exercise baseline. the warmth as the vascular rebound confirming the loading intensity crossed the threshold where the capillary beds were occluded by the intramuscular pressure. Twice daily, morning and evening. The morning walk wakes the tibialis anterior before the first real walking step of the day, ensuring that swing phase clearance starts at its daily maximum. The evening walk provides a second loading stimulus after 8 to 12 hours of subthreshold activation during normal gait. After 2 weeks, heel walking backward, the same sustained dorsiflexion hold with the added proprioceptive and cerebellar demand of backward locomotion. The cerebellum must recalculate foot placement without the visual field confirming the ground surface. The proprioceptive system works harder to compensate for the absent visual data. After 4 weeks, heel walking on a soft surface, carpet or grass, adding ankle stabilization demand to the dorsiflexion loading as the unstable surface forces the peroneal muscles to co-contract for lateral stability. 2 centimeters. The distance between your toe and the floor during every step you take, maintained by a muscle that has never once been loaded at the level required to preserve its force-generating capacity. The margin narrows while you walk, compounding silently through the 50s and 60s and 70s, invisible until the day the toe catches and the surface that tripped you turns out to be flat. 30 seconds on your heels widens it back. The floor has not changed. Your foot has.